Build compelling real-time apps quickly and scale them globally with the PubNub real-time network. Only PubNub delivers the core building blocks needed for any real-time application. Find out for yourself by signing up for free today. Visit pubnub.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Untether.tv. I'm your host and founder, Rob Woodbridge. Look, for 400 and something episodes, all my life, it seems that we've been driving towards this thing around mobile. It is a crazy, crazy, crazy revolution, and now I believe that you believe that this is actual reality. Now the question is, what is the implication of us carrying these devices, of you carrying this device everywhere you go, doing everything that you do, and eventually paying for things, keeping all your loyalty and your credit cards inside of your wallet, and maybe your key and your identification? These are big topics that I don't believe we know the answer to yet, the implications of which haven't been felt. So what do? Well, we're going to talk to Nora Young, who is the author of The Virtual Self and a host on CBC, the host of actually the very popular technology podcast and show called Spark. She is in Toronto. I am in Ottawa. We will drop the the tension between the two cities, and we will focus on the things that are needed to understand what the implication of these mobile devices are on the virtual self, big data, and how it's going to impact us going down the future. Nora, thank you so much for being a part of this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Cross-provincial rivalry here.
It is. It's not hockey season, so it doesn't matter, right? Toronto, we can love each other today, but right. As soon as October 1st rolls around, it's Toronto and Ottawa. We cannot speak to each other. But I just want to put a little, bring a little screen up. This is Nora's book. It's called The Virtual Self. How Our Digital Lives Are Altering the World Around Us. Fascinating, freaking fascinating read. I loved it. Made me think about a ton of things, and I want to kind of surface a lot of that as we go through this episode today. But before we do that, talk about you. I gave a quick overview, but who are you? What do you do? CBC, the Spark, the book?
Well, I'm a journalist, and I focus really on the intersection of technology and culture. So my show Spark, which is going into its 7th season this weekend, in fact.
Congratulations.
Amazingly, it's the 7th season. It really is about technology and culture. So we don't tend to do product reviews so much. We do things like, how is this changing the shape of our society? How is this changing the way we work, live, go to school, date, all that kind of stuff. And not that there's anything wrong with product review shows, it's just what we do. So, and I come to that with a background in arts and culture, but a lot of new media stuff. So I've been kind of swimming in the sea for a long time. And so I came to CBC with the idea for Spark about 7 years ago, and I love it.
And the Spark is fascinating. It's where I heard about Raspberry Pi. It's where you kind of surface this, what I would think of the fringe of the technology and how it intersects with the way that we live. And when Raspberry Pi all of a sudden became part of everybody's lingo, I thought back to the Spark episode. I thought, I heard that first on Spark.
Yeah,
is that the goal?
Yeah, I mean, I think our thinking is that if you can look at sort of the fringes, almost sometimes the odd edges where people are doing things that seem a little bit freaky, but that is actually where the new normal is going to be in, I would say a year to 5 years, right? Yeah. That's sort of the time that we're going at. And when you think about things like Raspberry Pi or something like that, I would love to feel that, because when I hear from people, I think for a lot of people, maybe people who aren't as technically savvy as you are, that there's a lot of anxiety about technology and how quickly things are changing. And so what I would love to be able to do is for people to say exactly that kind of thing, right? Like that when the topic comes up at work or, in conversation, that they're like, oh yeah, I'm comfortable because I know that from Spark. I heard about it 6 months ago or a year ago.
It must be hard. I do this, and I try to surface some of these new companies, these new emerging trends in technology, especially in the mobile space. But it's very difficult to find those companies that you think, okay, what they're doing is monumental. And then sometimes when I sit down and have a conversation on Untether, I sit and have the conversation with somebody that I'm not really sure where they fit in, but by the end of it, we've surfaced something that is incredible. Like this is life-changing or altering, but they're a small company, in Lincoln, Nebraska, and they're never going to materialize in the market, but that market will materialize. How do you do it? How do you find these guys? Come on, tell me your secrets,
It's
Nora.
the middle of the week and you're looking at this space on the board where, it's like, well, there's 8 minutes that's got to be filled with something. So you do have these little panicky moments. And I mean, obviously sometimes you're wrong, but we're a small group of people, but we all work really hard at trying to find that, exactly as you say, that spot where maybe it's not going to be the next Apple, but it tells you something about the way we live now or the way we live 5 years from now. So yeah, you just keep looking and keep looking.
Yeah, you do a great service demystifying this world of technology, because it is confusing. And I don't think there is a more confusing thing that's going on right now in our world than this convergence of self and data and what that means and the implications of that. I mean, we're starting to see it with all that's happening in the States, and we're starting to see this with all of the tracking software that's going on, and there's a balance between good and evil, and it's demystifying that and making sure that people are clear on the implications of what they do, like an 18-year-old being too liberal on Facebook, right, and the implications 18 years down the road when they might be running for office. So there's this challenge where we have to educate very quickly, don't we, in this world?
We do, and I mean, I think one of the challenges, like in the journalistic space anyway, is that things really do tend to get broken down into technophiles and technophobes and left and right. But to me, technology is. You can't really break it down to this is great or this is terrible, right? Because it's both.
Right.
And that, I think, is where the most intelligent conversations happen. But unfortunately, a lot of it really does get broken down into either this kind of hysterical, Facebook kind of side, or yay, everything new is fantastic. And if you say otherwise, then you're involved in a moral panic or whatever, right? So I think that we have to be a lot more mature about it and think about things, as you say, and a lot of the surveillance stuff is pointing out some of the darker side, I think. And I think part of the challenge is that things are changing so quickly. And one of the things I felt when I was writing the book was that it's almost like these little pieces of this jigsaw puzzle have come together. Sort of from the bottom up. It wasn't like suddenly there was this top-down decision, hey, we're going to live in this mobile, always-on world. It just kind of started to happen. And, social networking took off, and cellies took off, and all this other kind of stuff happened. And it's only now that we're starting to see, wait a minute, we're starting to live in a radically different kind of way. And we have all these social norms and mores and standards and laws that were designed around a different time, and we're still in the process of, playing catch-up.
Yeah, I'd like to say, I think it's inadvertent. We got here inadvertently, right? Mm-hmm. And now we're dealing with the consequences. I just want to clear something up here, is that you will find neither a mature nor intelligent conversation here. Okay, so I just want to clear that up. I want to set expectations here. Yes, I will be taking lots of notes, and you can bring the maturity and the intelligence into this conversation, because I'm lost. No. So the idea for the book obviously stems from what you get exposed to such great stories through Spark and through being a journalist and inquisitive and the things that you surfaced on it. I mean, I want to touch on a number of the things, but what was the idea behind the book? Why write a book in this world that we are in right now? Start there.
Yeah.
Attention deficit, right?
It is a huge thing of why even write a book when things are changing so quickly. Yeah. First of all, I wanted to say, let's take a step back, and maybe the particulars or the particular examples that I'm using might change, but the underlying bigger cultural differences have a longer shelf life. I certainly hope so anyway. The idea that I started with was, and I actually pitched the idea way back in the fall of 2009. So at that time, you weren't really talking that much about mobile as much as you were just talking about things that I'm starting to see, again, at the fringes. Like, we did this story that my colleague Dan Meisner brought to the table about this guy, Nicholas Felton, who later went on to work for Facebook. But at that time we interviewed him because he was involved in this really extreme example of self-tracking. He was basically tracking everything he did in his life, like how many pops he drank, how many times he played poker in a year, and every year he would put out this annual report, quote unquote, of sort of the summary of his life in numbers. And at the time, we thought, well, that's interesting. It probably says something about the culture, even though nobody was doing things that extreme at the time, or almost nobody. And I started to feel, as I thought about that more, that you could see the beginnings of this kind of thing, of the desire of people to kind of keep a statistical record of what they're doing. And I have to say that as I saw it, as I was researching the book, it started to build and build and build, and smartphones kept becoming more ubiquitous. And even since the hardback came out, I feel like it seems, now nobody would blink an eye if you say, boy, we're all living in this quantified self world now, because every second person is wearing a Nike Fuelband or tracking something. There you go, right? Almost everybody is doing that, or it seems like almost everyone's doing that. So it just seemed like we were at this sort of point where what started as a fringe activity was about to become very normal, and where you could see the pieces of the puzzle coming together so that self-tracking is not just this individual habit, but that it's something that culturally and societally we're starting to do, particularly as our analog practices are replaced with digital practices, right? And as we move from paper and pencil, metaphorically, to digital, we're starting to use devices that, in quotes, know how they're being used. So that part of the feature of being digital is that the technologies we use know how they're being used, right? And so once you start thinking about that, and once you start thinking about it's not only the thing I carry in my hand, it's all the little bits of pervasive computing power out there in the world around me that are ticking up information from air quality to where people are going and all this other kind of stuff, that you start to see this is a statistical world. It's not just a statistical life. It's the society.
It strikes me. One of the great things in here is that in the book, among other things, is the kind of the realization is that I'm a part of this. We're all a part of this. We're carrying these devices. Anybody who's carrying these devices understand. Anybody who uses like Waze and contributes to the greater good of other people in a car, kind of has an inkling of this. But the way you described it is so astute, and I'm not going to read your words. I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit. Is that that transition from paper and pencil to these devices in the smartphone, we're kind of losing ourself, aren't we? Because we're not quantifying our emotions and our feelings of maybe what they used to do in before technology allowed you to do this. What we're doing is we're quantifying the number of steps and the number of calories we consume if it's convenient and easy for us. And if it's not, if I have to think about how I'm feeling and write it down, I shove that side off. So like there is a real, I think there's a societal impact that happens here when all of a sudden you're not quantifying the self, you're quantifying the step.
Yeah. Well, this is just to get back to where we started out talking about technology being neither good nor bad, right? Yeah. I mean, I think that it's very much a mixed bag, like what we're starting to do. And to me, some of the dangers of it are that, exactly as you say, that we sort of risk losing what we can't quantify, that there's a certain, I think that's the problem, right? That in a way, as a culture, we're a bit drunk on numbers. And if we kind of reduce our lives to what turns up on a beautiful graph or on a spreadsheet, and we're missing like what about me is not turning up there, then that I think is a bit of a danger. And I do think that there's a tendency to be a bit surfacey, or to use a $5 word, performative about it.
Right.
That it's, in the sort of comical negative side, we've all seen those things of people like putting out on Twitter, like, yay, I just ran 5 kilometers or whatever, right? The sort of kind of humble bragging that people do on social media. But even not in that sense, I think there's a sense in which we want to kind of look at, and I think this is a very fundamental human emotion, this desire to kind of look at ourselves and say, that's me, hey, that's who I am, to tell a story about ourselves. But of course, the story of ourselves isn't just the numbers. The story of ourselves is all those highly subjective things, the way we understand ourselves, the way we reflect on what happened to us during our lives, that can't actually be quantified. And that, one of the people that I talk about in the book, the academic Victor Meyer-Schonberger, talks about this idea of memory. And I think in some ways that we're losing this distinction between memory as capturing the facts of what happened, right? When you can go back and revisit the conversation that you had with somebody or the argument you had with your boyfriend or girlfriend, 10 years ago, and you can capture the facts of it versus the subjectivity of how you feel about it and how that changes over time, right? And I think that's a real danger when you start recording everything, that you start to miss that distinction between recording and remembering, which is a really important difference.
I love that. Is that your statement just around the perception of who you want to be ultimately is what you're pushing out there. You're not going to put out the negative, right? You're not
Yes.
gonna, nobody puts out the fact that I'm in Cornwall. Yeah, but like I'm in Rome, you're going to get 1,000 photos. I'm in Cornwall, you're not going to get anything. So it's you kind of push out who you want to be perceived as, and the way I kind of think about this is that, look, Facebook is who who you want your friends to think you are, right? And all those social networks, the same thing with Instagram and with Twitter. Who your friends and your business partners and associates, who you want them to think you are, and then your true self is what you type into the Google search bar, right? And ultimately, that's the distinction. And I think that these devices allow us to lend credence to that side where it is the perception of who I am versus actually who I am. And except for the self-trackers, the guys who are, with the cameras mounted onto them that are following them everywhere they go, they can't hide. Now, throughout your research for the book, and from what you've seen since the book was published, obviously, as you said earlier, there's been a pull from mobile, right? During the internet days, it was a push. You had to convince somebody that they needed a website. You had to convince somebody that they needed to get online. But with mobile, we kind of woke up one day and there were 5 billion connected devices around the world, and smartphones accelerating, and everybody experimenting. So obviously, this has had a huge influence on the way that we use these to self-track and to create our virtual self. How big is this phenomenon? How far does this stretch? Is this a North American thing, or are we seeing this around the world?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think is the most interesting in the book is uncovering research about using cell phone data in particular in the developing world. And so in this case, we're generally not talking about smartphones, we're talking about ordinary feature phones. But there's some really interesting research that's been done by people like Nathan Eagle and people out of MIT into the idea of if you can anonymize the data about where people are, what are some of the things that you can learn? And so they've used it to do things like track, and not even track, but predict where malaria outbreaks are going to happen based on the movement of anonymized cell phone data. And this is a feature of how quickly cell phones have been spread through the developing world. So you take a country like Kenya, for instance, and cell phone penetration rates amongst people, I think between the ages of about 15 and 60, are very close to 100%. So you're talking about suddenly this location-based data being potentially very useful precisely in context where more formal information might not be available. Or there has been incredible use of cell phone data in Haiti after the crisis there to track things like the spread of cholera and where people are going and that kind of thing. And obviously, it raises huge questions about privacy. Sorry, there's a plane going overhead. Huge questions about privacy and how you protect people's data and whether anonymous data can really truly be anonymous, or whether there are risk factors there. And I think the research suggests that there are risk factors there. But I think you're looking at something that might be, in fact, globally transformative once you start to think about what you can use this information for.
And we're seeing this, from a commercial standpoint. A lot of people are trying to take the location data and use it to sell goods, or to geofence or to to get trends, traffic trends, and people trends, and when you look at what happens in developing nations versus what we're doing in North America, do you I don't know, do you feel kind of embarrassed, like I do, about how we're kind of superficially trying to use this data to line our pockets versus what they're actually doing in developing nations? You know, from that, is that tracking the spread of malaria, to also education and training and learning where people would never have learned before. Do you feel kind of superficial being here?
I mean, I'm very excited about the more sort of altruistic things, but I don't know if I feel. I mean, I think as long as those commercial relationships are transparent and on the up and up, there isn't I don't see a problem with it. And I think the really interesting space, what I think from a commercial point of view, is when you look at things like Waze. If you look at the potential to actually combine a useful service to individuals with something that potentially could make money for the people who design it, with something that actually has a social benefit, that I think is a really, really interesting space. Because what I think is going to happen culturally is that as people start to track their data more, they're going to start to become a little bit more proprietary about their data, right? I mean, once you realize, oh, I can learn all these interesting things about how I read and my exercise patterns and how much I weigh and what I eat and all this other kind of stuff, I think people are going to start to think about if it's worth something to me, what is it worth to other people? What is our data collectively worth? And I think the really great space is if you can think, and there are a lot of really interesting examples of this, of taking something that has an individual value, a commercial value, and a social value. And that, I think, is really going to be the sweet spot as people start to think about the value that their data has. And that, I think, has huge potential from a commercial point of view.
Do you think that, I'm one of these guys that when they ask me for my postal code at IKEA, I always say, okay, so what's in it for me, right?
Yes.
I'm going to give you some data that's very valuable to you, which is my postal code. It might be just one of the 1 billion you collect every year. But I constantly think about it, right? I think, well, my data, that information is worth something. So how do you think that this plays out when a lot of this stuff is collected anonymously through the carriers, through the browsers that you use, through the location tools that you use? I mean, I use an app called Moves. I rave about this app because while this tracks steps, Moves tracks places and locations and steps as well. But I use it to remember where I've been. But that data sits somewhere in Sweden in the cloud. And at some point, it's going to be valuable to them. And I constantly think, am I going to be able to make a living off of my data at some point?
Yeah.
Like, do you think that'll happen?
Well, there are people who are arguing for that kind of thing. Jaron Lanier's latest book, what the heck is it called? Who Owns the Future, I think it's called. He's arguing exactly that maybe it's the case that privacy's gone out the window, but maybe we can rejig the system so that we have a series of micropayments, for instance, that can allow people, if not to make a living, at least can supplement their living doing that. So if people are making that kind of argument, my feeling about it is that, there's nothing more inherently problematic in gathering data in exchange for a service than in being a television broadcaster and saying, okay, I agree to provide you programming, and the quid pro quo is you agree to, to be exposed to advertising, right? I mean, there's an implicit relationship there. And I think as long as those relationships are transparent, it's not problematic. The challenge, I think, is that, and I'll talk about this in the book, is that we're not yet in that world where we have transparent, clear rules about who's doing what with the data and so on. And partly that, I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one reason that that's happening is because it's sort of in the nature of startup culture that you think, okay, let's think of the great idea and try and get users, and then we'll figure out how to monetize it afterwards. And if you don't know what you want to do with the data, then it's pretty hard to have a transparent relationship about the data. I think that's one problem. I think another problem is just, and one of the people I talked to in the book, Ian Kerr, talks about this, is that once we're relying only on the standard form contract, the I agree thing, that's not really sufficient. We need to recalibrate that relationship and what the nature of those contracts can be and should be. But then the other piece of the puzzle, I think, too, is that it's almost like a math problem, is that I don't think we quite even know what the math implications of all this stuff is when you start to put together not just one data set, when you start to put together 18, 25, 1,000 data sets, what is anonymous and what is not. And there's been some really interesting research that's been done precisely about this. I mean, you probably follow the Netflix example of where they had this thing where it was a contest to improve the algorithms to offer people movie recommendations, and they released this huge anonymous, in quotes, data set of users, and researchers at the University of Texas were able to pair that with another data set and identify, not everybody, but they were able to identify some people. So I think there are multiple layers that we have to get sorted out here. But I think the potential, first of all, the genie's out of the bottle, as it were, right, is pretty hard to sort of roll things back and say, hey, we're not going to do mobile, we're not going to track anything anymore because we're doing it. But also, I think we have to think more clearly about it, because that information can be very useful and it can make our communities run better. It can help us as individuals too. So I think we're just not. It's like I said before, the situation is changing so quickly that the framework around it in some ways I think hasn't quite caught up with that.
And it takes a company like Path or a company like Apple to infringe on something that, push a limit, even if it's for the betterment of the product, right? Apple's fiasco was that they stored your location in an unencrypted file on your phone. And the reason they did that, if you believe this, and it takes a little bit of faith, and I believe it, is that, it enabled the location aspect, the GPS aspect, much faster than it would be if it had to go out and find a signal and a connection and it drained your battery less. And Path, they just thought it was a cool service to be able to enable you to invite more people into your circle in Path. Just turns out that don't do those things, and that's how we find the boundaries. But do you think that, like, that adage that Facebook has kind of realized and woken up to, and actually, in not so many ways, but admitted to this, is that you are the product. If it's a free thing that you are engaged in, which is most mobile apps now, freemium, and that adage is that, if you're not paying for it, you're not buying a product, you are the product. And do you think that can be sustained in this world where we're so concerned, we're going to get much more concerned about the data that is out there about us?
Yeah, I think there is a little bit of a pushback. I mean, you're starting to see things like data lockers and some data activism. I mean, that again is happening at the fringes. So, I mean, there's a guy I believe he's in California, who had a pacemaker defibrillator. And what he has been pushing for is access to his pacemaker data. Yeah. And when he first approached the company about this, they said, well, that's our data. You can have our data, right? And so now he's like, wait, what do you mean? That's my heart rate. And that's a bleeding edge case. But I think you're going to start to see more and more things like that. Like that seems weird now is not going to be weird in 2 years, 5 years. So there is pushback, I think, coming as people feel those kind of uncanny, creepy moments of like, oh, I didn't know you knew that about me, And we've all had those moments, right? That even if the information is out there, suddenly it appears in a context that you weren't expecting, and it freaks you out, right? And it gives you the creeps and the hair stands up on the back of your neck.
Yeah. You look behind you to see, okay, somebody's here, right? Yes.
Exactly, right? And I think that the thing is that the mores around that are changing so quickly that we don't even necessarily know where those points are, right? That you can have a company that thinks, hey, that'd be a cool feature if we did that, and not realize that people are going to flip out about it, because who knows what people are going to flip out about, right? Because 5 years ago, things that made us creep out are not creepy to us anymore, right? So I think we're in a very interesting, I don't know what the answer to that is. I think we're in a very interesting space in terms of negotiating the relationship. And again, to talk about it from a commercial point of view, I think there is a space that's available and open, at the very least, for being people who are trusted sources of keeping your data, right? Especially if you think about areas where there's bound to be huge growth in self-tracking, like health, right? That being able to say, okay, you're storing your data with us about your exercise and your health and all the stuff that your insurance company would probably love to get its hands on. This is the nature of the relationship you have with us. It's completely transparent. This is exactly what we're doing with your data. This is how we're protecting your data, all that kind of stuff. And I think it's going to be a mixed bag of solutions. I think in some cases, maybe people will be willing to spend a reasonable amount of money, like whatever it is, I don't know, $20 a year or something, for services that they think it's really important for them to keep private, like healthcare information. And then a lot of stuff that is probably somewhat more trivial information that people are pretty comfortable just, well, really, if you want to track my steps, that's fine. Go ahead. I don't care if you keep that data or not, right? So I think we're going to see a multiplicity of solutions to that as this kind of shakes out.
Health is very interesting. I interviewed the founder of something called Ubiki Health, and I think it's just an example of a small startup that focused on one thing, which was migraine sufferers. So they created an application that allowed you as a migraine sufferer to document the things, your life, basically track your life, so that they could look for, and they got 40,000 people to sign up for this, this field trial, which is a huge number when you think about it. They committed to doing this for 90 days, and they tracked the food that they took. It took the barometric pressure and the temperature and the humidity and everything that triggers migraines, like sleep as well, and diet and exercise. And then they combined all that, and they did it on behalf of big pharma, right? So that they could look for triggers, a swath of triggers that they could then look at seeing if they can get into some preventative medicine. And I think that as long as you have an open relationship and an understanding that that's how the data is going to be used, that is of tremendous value to migraine sufferers. If they can, stop eating parsley 4 days before, the humidity reaches 88%, that data. And then I think the thing that's missing from there is some kind of notification that rings in your house that says, don't eat that here because you're going to get, there's a finish here that we don't have. But you can see that. That's a good use. And then I think of the things that you just mentioned around insurance and the information that you could collect about driving and your speeds and all of those things, like basically your life's black box, which is what we're talking about here. And the implications of that. I think that we think in the center, the average consumer, the average person thinks, oh my God, that's going to be terrible. And the person who smokes over here thinks that, no, I don't want my insurance to know. And the person who's very athletic over here says, yeah, I want a discount. Yep. But that stuff has to be on the fringe. And at some point, 5 years from now, do you think, Nora, that will be in the center and everybody will accept it as a norm like we did Foursquare? Because 5 years ago, the idea of checking in and telling people where I was going to be, not even on a radar at that point. So do you think that we're heading in that direction?
Yes, I do. And I think you're already starting to see that with, there have been these sort of experiments with offering people discounts on their insurance if they're willing to have devices in their cars that track the way they're driving. And again, it'll be interesting to see how this shakes out. I mean, does it end up being of a benefit to the consumer, or does it end up being a more punitive thing, right? Like, you're not going to get insurance unless you agree to have this device on your car, right? I mean, there are all kinds of ways that could potentially shake out. I think your example of the migraine tracking is a really good example of exactly what I'm talking about, but where the potential is there, of something that's personally beneficial to individuals and something that's beneficial to the broader community. And I absolutely think that's going to be totally normal in, I don't even think 5 years, I think 2 years.
We're moving that quickly. And imagine the scenario when everybody has a smartphone or something like that, and your wallet is attached to it. And this is where you start to think about the implications of these things, where, you want to eradicate drunk driving, at least in North America, when the population is big enough or large enough for the smartphone population. We're over 50%, but still growing. Canada is a perfect example. We could do it in Canada. But, as soon as we have whatever that mobile wallet looks like and whatever the mobile payment system is that you're on and location aware and all that data feeds into one spot, you can essentially not start your car based on the fact that you've bought 4 drinks at this bar within the last 3 hours, right? So you sit in your car and you try to turn on the key that's powered by your phone, and it looks it up where you've spent your money, and it says, no way, Jose, we're not going to let you in the car. We're not going to let you start. And you're kind of... It's Big Brother, but then it's societal benefit, and they've got at some point clash in a big way, and something breaks through, obviously. Yeah,
and I mean, I think it's a really interesting question of how, and if you're interested in following this, Evgeny Morozov's latest book is about a lot of this exact question. Is that, yes, there's a lot of social benefit, but at what point does it become like rats in the Skinner box, right? Where you're kind of doing social engineering to produce certain outcomes which are beneficial, but in some ways you're denying people's subjectivity. You're denying their ability to make their own kinds of choices. I think that's in a way, a profound change that all of this stuff points to. And it does get to, as we start to think about this big data world where we can make all sorts of correlations about people's behavior, it does raise a lot of those, I think they're almost, spiritual questions really about how much we want to encroach on people's own ability to make choices about their own lives, and how much we want to, and the other thing about this too is we have to be careful that we don't overstep the bounds of what we think the data can tell us, right?
Does that mean we assume we don't want to assume too much, or?
Well, I think the data can. I think humans are very good at reading things into things, right? Yeah. Data can suggest things, but maybe there are alternate explanations for it, right? Or, I was thinking about this the other day when I had been, Google was prompting me saying, "Oh, your trip to the office is going to be delayed by a minute because the traffic has changed." But, I walk to work, and I thought, that's funny. It's making assumptions about how it thinks that I get to work, right? And you can imagine a scenario where it's not just one thing, it's like all of these smart tools in your life that are making assumptions about what you want to do, what happens if they're not right, and how frustrating that could be, right? That's a danger too, is just from the level of personal annoyance or the level of like social harm of making wrong assumptions about what people are doing based on what the data appears to be showing you.
Yeah, like sometimes I think that we have these, we're in this industry, so we look at it and think, oh, big, wondrous world that we're about to embark on in big data, but there's something called serendipity, isn't there? Like all the dating services about compatibility and bringing people together, that are deemed compatible by data. It takes that serendipity out of a bar meetup, right? Where you work through the differences, and you learn over time to work with somebody, to be with somebody for a lifetime. And are we going to lose that serendipity if we go down this path too far?
Yeah, and it's something that's come up with self-tracking for sure, but also even with search, is that idea of like, if you're always being given what you want, how are you going to find the thing that you didn't know you wanted until you find it, right? Like that's, the beautiful thing about particularly like living in a big city and walking down a street that you've never been down before, or going to, I was thinking about this the other day with travel, about how when you go to a different city and maybe you don't speak the language that well and you get lost and you have to stumble around and you have to ask people directions. And that can be frustrating and it can be scary, but that's also can be potentially a really great thing. You can learn a lot from those accidental things. You can make new friends because you had to actually talk to somebody instead of like looking at the directions on your iPad, right? So there are kind of downsides to that. And I think you have to remember to leave yourself open to turning the device off, leave yourself open to wandering through a city instead of saying, what does Urban Spoon tell you about where you should eat in this particular neighborhood? That I think there's a real value in that. And humans, we are all pretty much control freaks, and if we can control for all contingencies, I think a lot of us want to do that. But in some ways, the most exciting space is in chance, right?
And how do you replicate that in a mobile or a data environment?
They give me an app to give me bad information, so then I can go wandering off on my own.
Well, get me lost. And I think that's what Apple was trying to do with their first Apple Maps, right? Was, hey, we just want we want to bring serendipity back. So you might end up where you're supposed to be, or you might not. But it's going to be an adventure. Yeah. They're smarter than us. That's the key. It is. I often wonder about that. Is that when you jam so much data into something, is that is there just going to be an app that tells you that one day your alarm doesn't go off because it's done this determination about the world around you and the traffic and the smog and the temperature and your mood based on the how much REM sleep you got the night before. It just says we're not going to set your alarm because don't get out of bed today. That's just our advice. All this data tells us not to get out of bed today. Just enjoy your sleep. And part of me thinks, that's the, perfect clean world. And the other side of it is that there's no dirt, right? Hand sanitizer and no kids playing in mud is what it means to me in my head. And so I'm stuck in the middle here because I see the future and I see it coming down and there's so many benefits to it all. But then on the flip side is that I don't want my kids to be that sterile when it comes to making decisions, right?
Well, and also, I mean, there's this question of like, well, how do you learn and become an adult if you're not? I mean, I think the analogy of kids is really true, right? I mean, that's how kids become adults who have good judgment, is because they make mistakes and they realize, oh, I shouldn't have had 10 candy bars because now I feel sick. You know, like you do all those things that the analogy is kind of with parenting. If you have a parent that never lets their kid do anything or make a mistake or fall in the mud or whatever, they're not going to mature into responsible adults, right? And if you're, by analogy, if you let your apps make your decisions for you, how are you going to come to exercise good judgment? And what are you going to do when there's power failure and you don't have access to your apps, right?
There's nothing. Yeah, exactly. How do we live?
To do.
You have to look up from your screen, and you know it is very interesting. Is that, but I think that there's a balance, right? That there's a generational thing here, and I'm 43, and I look at 19-year-olds and 20-year-olds and the way that they interact with the screens and the way that they do their things. And I mean, I use this phone as a lifeline for me. It's how I gather my information. It's my data. And for me, I don't really mind that it tracks me to an extent, right? You know, because I live what I do digitally in the open, right? Very, very, very much in the open. And you know, I never want to be hindered by that, but I definitely worry about these moments where that next generation just has unfettered, unfiltered feelings and pushing all this stuff out into the ether. And I wonder what it means for them in 20 years when they're getting into my age, thinking, will this be the norm, or will they have regrets about how much information they've shared throughout their lifetime? Because it can be used against you at some point, and it will be. Yeah.
I think you and I are both getting into that "you kids get off my lawn" territory here.
Exactly.
I think that is really, in a way, there is the potential for that kind of a problem. I mean, my gut tells me that at some point, unless you've done something really egregious, that we're all going to, and I'm hardly the first person to say this, that, you know, at some point everyone's going to have some embarrassing things out there about them. So, you know, maybe we all just kind of learn to live with it. And, you know, I mean, the other thing, I think, not to get too wool gathering about it, but that the idea of privacy that we have, that, you know, you and I grew up with, that's now being changed and morphing, is not something that's been with us since the beginning of time. You know, that in itself is a fairly new invention, you know, a few hundred years old. And over human history, we've had different notions of privacy. And, you know, if you were living in a village in, I don't know, the 1500s, your sense of the concept of personal privacy really probably didn't exist, right? Or existed in a very different kind of way. So in some senses, I think it's because we're at this exact moment and we're seeing both worlds that we're kind of flipped out about it. But the privacy and private and public are both pretty fluid concepts.
Yeah, and I wonder if we're at that point where, you know, a year from now we will have turned one way or the other, and we'll be back to, we'll feel a little bit more comfortable, or not floating, I suppose, between the two. And I think that's where I'm sitting right now, is that you know, it's the same thing I try to teach my kids: anticipation, because there isn't any left in this world, right? When Bruce Springsteen was about to release an album, they would put it on this sheet at HMV, and I'd have to go into the store, and it was an experience to go into the store and find out when the release date for that CD or that album was, and then I would go home and wait for it, right? There was no releases, there was no Twitter, there was no updates, and then when it came, I would have to go back to the store and buy it, and the experience of unpackaging and playing the music for the first time. I try to explain that to my kids who want, you know, Teen Beach movie music right now all the time, and I can give it to them. It's hard to create anticipation with this, but it's the same thing around privacy. It's a big challenge to instill that in a child, and even in an adult, which is, you know, much more difficult.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Do you think, my last question here, it's a big one. As we go into the future, I have this theory around census and taxes and things that are onerous for humans to do. And I wonder, at some point, does all of this land somewhere, and, you know, it's an automated census machine, or it's an automated tax machine, where it's just like, you know, everything is filed for you, everything is done for you through big data, with or without your permission, right? You know, when taxes went to, prepaying taxes, removing it right from your paycheck, from the honor system at the end of the year, paying it. Obviously collection was significant, but I start to think about census and the challenge that we have in 2 or 3 year old information and taxes, for example. All that information is out there. Do you think at some point we're never going to have to fill out a census form or fill out our taxes again as a result of this? Metaphorically, is that where we're going?
I was just going to say, if you could promise me that tomorrow I don't have to do my taxes anymore, I'm completely on board.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I think the trend is certainly going towards things being automatic, right? I mean, we've talked mostly today about the sort of conscious level at which we're choosing to track things, but as more and more stuff is digital, I think the trend is going more towards the default being gathered automatically. That's certainly the overwhelming way that things seem to be moving, I think. I think the question will be, where are going to be the pressure points where people go, and I suspect taxes will probably be one of them, where people say, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with that level of things being automatic. But, culturally, we see this with privacy too, the argument of, if you're not doing anything wrong, what are you worried about, right? That, which I find troubling. I think that we should be thinking about what are the things that I want to take responsibility for, or that I want to keep private, not because I'm doing anything wrong, but just because it's none of your damn business, or
my
just
choice.
Because I want to exercise some agency in this area, right? Human agency is a really important thing. Human responsibility is a really important thing. And at what point does it become offloading too much of what as individuals we should be taking responsibility for? But it'll be interesting to see where those pressure points are, and where people get up on their hind legs and say, no, I'm not doing that, because I think that the technology is certainly taking us in the other direction towards the automatic.
So for 7 years you've been doing this with Spark, obviously, and a journalist for much longer. Have you been surprised by anything that you've seen over these years, that has evolved, that you thought, when you saw it for the first time, you would have thought, there's no way that this will take off. There's no way that I would do that. And then 7 years later, you're thinking back, how did I get involved in this? How did this start?
Yeah, I think that the thing that's been most surprising for me, probably less surprising to your audience, because they're people who are really engaged in the mobile space, is the extent to which people got on board with linking of place and behavior. That surprised me, that people, choose to use Foursquare as one example. That I remember when Foursquare launched thinking, really? Really? But people, have taken to that. And you see it with all the activity in the mapping space now, how much energy there is around sort of annotating our geographical world and linking what we're doing and what we think about things to real geographical spaces. And that, to me, that's surprising to me, how quickly people have adopted it. And I think the reason they've adopted it is because there's because we have our phones with us, but also that it's clearly very powerful to do that.
I'm with you on that. It's I don't know what the lifeline of Foursquare is. I don't know what the lifeline of all of that software is, whether it evolves or whether it just becomes part of the operating system. And operating system is, the Internet of Things as well. But this 7 years has been fascinating to watch, right? Since the very first iPhone really emerged, and I've been doing mobile since 1999, and long before there was such thing as a smartphone, we were doing feature phone games for a local company called Magmec, and moved into BlackBerry, and then moved into applications and enterprise apps, and the evolution has been astounding, and it almost seems like every turn surprises me. Simply, I'm not shocked that it's happening, but it surprises me what sticks and what doesn't stick with people, and the valuations of some of these companies is incredible. But it's also the implication on businesses, the way that people use these tools for their businesses. I'm shocked that people aren't embracing this a little bit more, so my hope is that we're on the fringe of this stuff being adopted by business, so that they can service their customers a little bit more. And shockingly, there's a bunch of anywhere from 30 to 40% of some of these retailers and merchants that just don't believe that mobile and data and location is relevant to their business. And I think that's what I'm watching. It's going to be significant as it happens.
I should say, I know it sounds like I live beside the airport, but I think what's happening is it's the tail end of the Canadian National Exhibition. So I think there are like stunt planes flying overhead, which is why, if I thought about that, I would have closed these doors before we started our conversation.
It's so perfect. Well, I love it. You know, it's part of Canadian culture right there. Yeah, we all live near airports. That's and along the border. Mm. So, Nora, where can we send people? You said Spark resumes this coming weekend, and if you're listening to this after, it's obviously available as a podcast on iTunes through this, or through the CBC website. The book is just out in paperback as well now.
That's right.
So it's in every format. Yeah,
it's available as an ebook as well, and the paperback is available in the U.S. as well, and the ebook as well.
Okay.
And if you want to find out more about me and what I do, you can go to my infrequently updated website, norayoung.ca, or if you want to find out more about Spark or subscribe to the podcast, go to cbc.ca/Spark.
I love it. And you know what? It's got to be hard to keep up a blog as well as write books and do what you're doing with Spark. I mean, at some point you just got to detox, right?
Yeah, I did a lot of detoxing this summer. I lived an almost entirely analog existence this summer, which was welcome for sure. But yeah, my goal is to get back on the blogging path now that I've finished with the book for the time being. Anyway.
I'd like to see what there's a book right there is going from digital, immersed in digital to actually detoxing for a little while and then coming back and seeing what the world looks like. But I'll have to wait for that.
Yeah.
I'm not quite ready to do that yet. No. Nora, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time and insight. I mean, it's so fascinating. I can't wait to, first of all, share this with everybody who's listening. And if you are listening to this or watching this, go and do yourself a favor. Go and buy The Virtual Self. For not only because it's a great book, but I'm immersed in this industry, and I've interviewed thousands of people for this. And I think I probably had an aha moment a page as I was going through it. So for just that alone, I believe that you guys should be reading this book. I've made recommendations to everybody that I know, and now I'm making recommendation to you, the 600,000 strong out there. Please go and buy this book. Go and read it. And then I'd love your feedback on it. Please reach out to me, rob@untether.tv. And you can go to norayoung.ca, fill in the form. That's how I reached out to Nora. She responds. So if you have any comments about her book, suggestions, please. I'm sure she'd want to hear. Right?
Yeah. Thanks so much for the conversation. It was really great talking to you.
Thank you, Nora. And thank you guys for watching and listening wherever you are. Whatever you are doing, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time on untether.tv. Thanks, Nora.
Thanks. Bye-bye.